like to look at the minutes and approve the minutes for September 6th and September 20th.
Motion to approve.
Do we have a second to approve?
Second.
And let's do that for each set of minutes separately. So we're doing this for the September 6th meeting. All in favor of approving that set of minutes?
Aye.
Say
Aye.
Opposed? Okay, can we get a motion for the September 20th minutes?
A motion to approve?
Second?
I'll second it.
All in favor?
Aye.
Opposed? Motion carries. Any unfinished business? Hearing none, we'll go to new business and the review of the International Building Code, Chapters 16 through 35 and appendices. Hmm? Yeah, whoever's presenting will be down at that point, so yeah.
Want to introduce yourself for the
Okay.
record?
Justin Chamberg with Sandman Structural Engineers, presenting on chapters 16 through 23 of the IBC. All right, starting with the first one, page 361, section 1601.1. I recommend continuing the existing local amendment, which requires a structural engineer to determine engineering requirements of this code. Page 361, section 1603.1. This modification addresses construction document requirements for environmental and special loads. There's been updates to the rain, snow, and wind forces and what's required on the construction documents. Basically, they just need to show slope factor for snow loads, what the basic wind speed is, and what the rain intensity is on the front sheet of the construction documents. Page 363, section 1604.3.7. This is a new section that's been added and provides limits to the flexion of framing, which supports glazing. Before, there was never anything on this. They had their own industry standard, but now it's actually in the building code, which limits those deflections. Page 364, section 1604.5.1. These provisions address multiple occupancy within a structure, which now include exception exempting buildings in their entirety from needing to qualify as risk category 4 buildings when a storm shelter is part of the structure. Basically, if you got two buildings that are connected together and there's a storm shelter on one side, it used to be where you have to follow the requirements of the storm shelter or a higher risk category for the entire building, but now you can treat it as two separate buildings. Page 365, section 1604.10. This is an added section that addresses the development of storm shelter loads is to be based on the ICC 500, which provides wind speeds for tornado and hurricane shelter design using the ASC 7 load combinations. And this is different too than the FEMA regulations. FEMA has its own set of documents, so if there's ever a FEMA storm shelter, they have their own load combination requirements. Page 368, table 1607.1. This modification clarifies which heavy live loads can be used live load reduction. It also changes the required live load on decks and balconies to match what the ASC 7 has. The ASC 7 always had, you had 1.5 times your live load of the occupancy served on that floor. Now the IBC is just updating it to match what that ASC 7 has, so it's really not a change as long as the loads are followed. Page 373, section 1607.15.2. added a section that requires the minimum lateral load that firewalls must resist is 5 pounds per square foot. I think this ties in with any partition wall technically needs to be designed for an internal pressure of 5 pounds a square foot. I think it just clarifies that even firewalls need to have some stability to them. Page 374, section 1609. This modification changes the terminology in describing wind speeds. Ultimate design wind speeds is now called basic wind speeds, and nominal design wind speed is now called allowable stress design wind speed. It also increases the minimum distance without obstructions from 1 mile to 2 miles for buildings on a hill in order to match the ASC 7. And also there's been updates to the design wind speed maps, and the number of maps have increased as well.
Justin?
Yep.
Have you looked at it to see if this affects our area at all?
The maps, if it's a category 2 building, it has no effect, but I believe some of the higher risk category buildings, there is a slight change to that. And I can't remember where the cutoff point is, but the higher risk buildings, there is a little bit of a change there. As far as how these wind speeds are called, that's still the same. It used to be a 90 mile per hour ASD wind load and 115 mile per hour ultimate. That part has still stayed the same. They're just using different words to describe it.
So most buildings fall into 2,
Yeah.
wouldn't be affected.
Correct. When you get into schools with higher occupancies and any other significant buildings like that, that's when you're going to start running into category 3. Next page, page 391, section 1610.1. I recommend continuing the existing local amendment which allows the maximum height for basement walls to be designed for active pressure to be 9 feet instead of 8 feet. This is just saying if you have a flexible wood diaphragm, instead of using an at-rest pressure, you can use active pressure. To tie in with that, currently, we have the City of Fargo flood requirements that requires a tighter spacing of our anchor bolts on sill plates for basements. And if you look at that code, it's designed for 65 pounds per cubic foot, but that requires your anchor bolts to be set. Depending on the wall height, if you have a wall height that's 9 feet tall, you have to have anchor bolts at 8 inches on center. Well, when we get out of the flood zone, we still should be designing the basement walls for 65 pounds a cubic foot, but right now we're allowing builders to go 6 feet on center for the anchor bolt spacing. So the two aren't, they're complete opposite sides of the spectrum when it comes to spacing. I've seen houses around there, you have some issues with sill plates splitting and different things like that because of this anchor bolts being spaced too wide. And the IBC doesn't really cover the basements when it comes to sill plate fastening. It does say that the max allowed spacing is 6 feet, but there's nowhere in there that says what it has to be depending on the basement depth. And then same goes for when you have trusses running parallel to a basement wall, there's no requirements for blocking that blocks the top of basement wall into your floor at all. And the reason I bring this up, we've seen newer houses have some issues with not being properly connected at the top of the wall. So I just wanted to bring that up to see if that's something we want to look into or if that's already been addressed by someone else.
This issue has been discussed for years. 6 foot on center has been a standard for as long as I've been in building codes. And then the code did make a revision maybe 9 years ago to a tighter spacing, and I don't have the history on that. So maybe if you could look at those sections, and we have some time before we're going to get to the end of this process, so look at it and see if you can make some recommendation on the changes that you would make. And
Sure.
then I'd like staff to look at that and see what they see, 'cause a lot of them are going to have history on how we got to where we are today.
Yeah, I do know that the city, or sorry, not the city, but the code did change it a few codes ago to specify those spacings, but then they ended up taking it out completely. And I don't know the reasoning behind that. I don't know if they didn't want to be responsible for that.
I think it went from 6 foot to 6 inches,
Okay.
and people thought it was a clerical error, but it was not. The code actually went to 6 inches. And so many jurisdictions changed that, just not knowing why this went to that tight spacing. So,
Which isn't too far off from what the flood documents have. I mean, that has 8
Yeah.
inches on center. If you actually run the design, the full design through, what we have for safety factors, that is what is required sometimes. But, if we go across the river, I know on Minnesota side, they have amendments that, on a 9-foot basement, their anchor bolts are at 40 inches on center. So they didn't go extreme to have them really tight, but they
Yep.
sucked them in a little bit because they realized some of the issues we're having. Like I said, I've seen sill plates be splitting in half on a house that's less than 5 years old. So,
worse on where it's parallel with joist.
both
That's, I
sides.
reckon, for the blocking. So if you could do that, maybe take a few weeks, a month, and look at those sections, make recommendations, forward it to me. I'll get it to staff, and then we can put it on the agenda for another meeting.
Okay.
All right?
One thing I would want to throw in on that a little bit, if we can get the codes to be the same on both sides of the river, if their engineering works, that's going to make it much easier on your builders and things out there to have one code. And I know for a while Minnesota was talking about every 4 feet or 5 feet doing, cross bracing. With truss systems, the truss systems use 5-foot panels. So if they, brace off of those 5-foot panels where the CLBs are, if that works, great. It's the most cost effective and the best, probably best way to do it because the structure is already kind of designed that way. But, and I would certainly encourage less than 6 foot too. I do 3 foot myself just because I get too much of this in the wall. So I don't think you'll see a big issue with that, but you tell everybody 8 inches, you'll have a lot of HBA folks up here yelling at you, so
Yeah, for
let's
sure.
not overdo it anyway, so.
Yeah, and I was gonna look into how Minnesota came up with their amendment, what, they must have some type of testing or background, how they came up with that
Yeah.
4 feet on center, so I'll dig into it in the next few weeks and get back to everyone on it.
Yeah, touch base on that. We have monthly meetings with all the local building officials too, so I could show them. And it's nice for us to come to agreements on things. We could show it to home builders too.
Yeah, it just, if you can get the one code, it really helps. I mean, there's enough differences anyway, just because of the river, but as much as we can, it's helpful.
Yep, I agree. All right, moving on, page 392, section 1612. I recommend continuing the existing local amendment, which deletes this section in its entirety as it relates to the flood document. Page 398, section 1613. This modification brings the site coefficients contained in the IBC in alignment with the newest generation of ground motion attenuation equations regarding seismic design. Page 398, section 1613.2.1. This modification updates the IBC seismic maps to match new maps in the 2015 NEHRP provisions and the 2016 ASE 7 standard. I haven't looked to see if that affects our area. Even if it does, it's going to be pretty minimal, and seismic's 99% of the time not going to control. Chapter 17, page 418, section 1704.6. This modification adds section 1704.6.1, which requires a structural observation of buildings that are considered a high-rise or assigned a risk category 4. Page 419, section 1705.5.2. This modification requires special inspections on permanent bracing on any wood truss that is 60 inches or taller. So Bruce, how is this addressed right now? Is the city doing the special inspections on truss bracing?
Generally, there has not been special inspections on wood construction unless we require it. And maybe I could reach out to the special inspectors that are generally in the area and find out their experience with wood and see. Always a resort, we can go to the structural engineer, and we will even use the structural engineer of record on a project. You know, why wouldn't he want his design constructed correctly? So it's not that the truss is designed, but your project. And so we can use the structural engineer design of record or go outside.
I do know at this time that within the field that the inspectors, when they come out to do their framing inspections, they are taking either the truss manufacturer's engineered drawings or the structurals, and piece by piece, making sure that they're installed and everything's there that's supposed to be. And that's the majority of what their inspection's about. So that's kind of a typical anyway, thing that's going on.
We've seen 60-inch trusses, that's what I thought.
Yeah, you don't see that very often, so.
Well, and it doesn't really, from what I read, it doesn't really clarify what, where is that 60 inches measured? I mean, of course, if it's measured at any point along the truss, then almost every single sloped roof would fall under that category. But yeah, if it's flat trusses, then very rarely do you see trusses that deep. So from my understanding, it's pretty much any truss over that. But if you're already inspecting the bracing, then it should be a big change here, so. Okay. Chapter 18, page 431, section 1804.4. The existing local amendment specifies this section as 1804.4.4, which does not exist, and it should read 1804.4. So that's a change we'll have to make to our amendment to clarify that. This is a modification there is a modification in the 2018 code that reduces the required slope at door landings and ramps. However, I recommend continuing the existing local amendment that addresses surface drainage and accounting for settlement. Page 432, section 1804.5. I recommend continuing the existing local amendment, deleting this section in its entirety as it relates to flood. Also on page 432, section 1805.1.2.1, I recommend also continuing the existing local amendment, deleting this section in its entirety as it relates to flood. Page 436, section 1807.2. This modification deletes a requirement for pressure on a keyway of a retaining wall. It's not saying a keyway is required or you can't have it, it's just how you design it, so it really just affects the structural engineer that's designing it. Page 443, section 1809.5. I recommend continuing the existing local amendment which adds an exception for Group U occupancy buildings to not require a frost-protected foundation. Chapter 22, page 480, section 2207.1. This modification references the combined 2015 SGI 100 as the new reference standard for steel joists instead of the 4 separate specifications. They just combine them all into one manual, and that's how it references now. Page 481, section 2209.2, added section for referencing the cantilevered storage rack standard, RMI ANSI MH 16.3, which clarifies the characteristics, essential differences, and requirements for cantilevered storage racks. Page 481, section 2211, This modification now references the 2015 editions of the ASI standard for cold form steel, including AISI S240, AISI S400, and AISI 202. Chapter 23, page 485, section 2303.2.2. This modification clarifies that fire retardant treated lumber must be impregnated with chemicals as part of the manufacturing process. The use of paints, coatings, stains, or other surface treatments is not an approved method of protection as required in this section. Page 487, section 2303.6. This modification requires that nails and staples are required to conform to the standard ASTM F 1667 Supplemental 1. Minimum average bending moment values are added for staples as well. Page 491, table 2304.9.3.2. They added new alternate fastener schedule for construction of mechanically laminated decking, given equivalent power-driven fasteners for the 20-penny nail. Page 492, section 2304.10.5. This modification requires that staples used in preservative treated wood and fire retardant treated wood to be made of stainless steel. Page 493, table 2304.10.1. This modification aligns the 2018 IBC and IRC for supporting 8-penny common or ring shank nails when nailing 6 inches and 12 inches on center for roof sheathing. Page 497, section 2304.11. This modification reorganizes the heavy timber provisions of Chapter 23 and relocates the 2015 IBC table on engineered lumber dimensional equivalencies from Section 602.4 to Section 2304.11. Page 499, Section 2304.12.2.5, and also .12.2.6. Provisions for permeable floors and roofs have been modified to require positive drainage of water and ventilation below the floor or roof to protect supporting wood construction. Page 510, table 2308.4.1.1. This modification updates header and girder spans for the exterior bearing wall table and the interior bearing wall table to allow for Southern Pine number 2 rather than just Southern Pine number 1. Building width is also updated, supplying span lengths for narrower building areas. Page 519, section 2308.5.5.1. This modification allows single-member lumber headers in prescriptive wood framing, which allows to get more insulation in the header space. That's why they did that. Any questions? Thank you.
Good morning, board members. My name is Mike Moss. I'm a commercial building inspector here for the city of Fargo. And I will be reviewing the chapters 24 to 35 and the appendices of the 2018 IBC. We will get started on page 560. Section 2407.1.2. The following statement has been deleted when approved by a building official to be used as an exception, and now refer you to the ASTME standard for the panels to remain in place as a barrier following impact or glass breakage. We will move on to Page 569, sections 2603.4. Heavy timber is now, in accordance with section 602, has been added as an acceptable thermal barrier over foam plastic. So not a huge change there, but they are allowing heavy timber now to be used for that. Page 572, section 2603.7. Foam, plastic, and plenums used as interior wall or ceiling finish or interior trim shall exhibit a flame spread index of 25 or less and a smoke index of 50 or less unless they meet one of the new 3 exceptions that they added. So they basically just rescoped the whole thing. Didn't change a whole lot, they just rescoped the exceptions. Moving on to page 573, sections 2603.13. Requirements for cladding over foam sheathing and wood framing have been added to be consistent with the International Residential Code and cold form steel stud requirements. They basically just align them now so they're all the same between the IRC and IBC. Moving on to chapter 27, page 584. Section 2702.2.12. There's 2 erratas in this section alone. The words International Fire Code should be added after the section 5004.7. And also the words, they currently read grand plant at the end. That should be grade plane. We were proposing it to be a local amendment to read correctly, but it's just an errata, so we're not going to propose an amendment. Just note that those 2 things are both erratas. Moving on to chapter 29, page 587. The staff recommends continuing the existing local amendment, replacing the words International Plumbing Code with North Dakota State Plumbing Code. Basically, we don't reference the IPC, we reference the North Dakota State Plumbing Code. On page 589, section 2902.1, footnote F has been added to reference the International Swimming Pool and Spa Code. On page 590, section 2902.2, exception 4 has been added stating separate facilities shall not be required in business occupancies in which the maximum occupant load is 25 or fewer. This is a pretty big change, I thought, because it used to be 15. Now they're allowing 25 people for single-use facilities, only in a B occupancy, though. So, moving on to chapter 31, page 603. Section 3109. Section 3109 has been modified in its entirety to reference the International Swimming Pool and Spa Code. Staying on page 603, section 3111. This section has been renamed Solar Energy Systems. Staying on page 603, sections 3112 and 3113. Both these sections have been added to this chapter. Moving on to chapter 33, page 609, section 3310.1. At least one temporary or permanent stairway must now be provided in a building under construction once the building has reached a height of 40 feet as measured from the lowest level of fire department vehicle access. It was 50 feet previously, so they moved it down to 40 feet now. Page 610, Section 3313. Staff recommends continuing the local amendment, deleting this section in its entirety. Staying on page 610, Section 3314. This section has been added as new. And it's basically requiring, where required by the fire code official, fire watch shall be provided during the non-working hours for construction that exceeds 40 feet. So it's only when it's required by the fire code official. So that's new to the chapter. And page 643, the appendices chapters. None of the appendices were reviewed, nor will any be recommended for adoption in Fargo at this time. Basically, we just don't, we don't use the appendices. Not saying that we can't, but we just don't, we don't review them to use them. And that's all I have. Any questions?
I have a question on the Chapter 33, Section 3310.1, the temporary permanent stairway.
Yep.
It doesn't say whether that is to floors. Where is that stairway supposed to go to?
I believe it would go to each floor then.
Okay, so it doesn't say to floors. There are a lot of buildings that are 40 feet that have no intermediate floors. So
Yeah, I don't know how we would address that if it was without floors. It's 40 feet without. So you're saying buildings that are under construction that don't have the floors in place?
don't have intermediate floors. They're 45-foot clear height. For instance, the Fargo Dome doesn't have any floors in the middle, so where would the stair go? I'm just curious, because you're saying there needs to be a stair. I could see somebody come out and say, you got to build a stair, and it doesn't have any place to go.
Well, when I read this section, it kind of does coincide with, we have a similar requirement in the fire code for standpipes during construction. And once they've exceeded 40 feet in height of construction, then standpipes are required. So I'm wondering if this wasn't kind of tied in to go along with that so that they could require the stairway with the standpipes. And that one, I'm pretty sure, does refer to the floor. So it may just be,
If there wasn't any floors, I don't know, I mean, the stairs would have nowhere to go, I guess, so.
Exactly.
In those types of buildings, I don't think that's what they're referring to.
Okay.
But that is a good question, I guess.
You would think that they're referring to if people are on a floor above grade, that they have a way to escape.
Yes.
So whether we need to clarify that a little bit or nothing, or something, just to make sure that it's not confusing. But, you know, if it's a 45-foot building, they're either standing on the floor or they're working off a piece of equipment.
Yeah.
So, you know, but I don't know if that would be something to consider.
Sometimes you have to read this new sections several times just to digest it. And so I've done it. The word extend pops out at me. So if there is no stair, how would you really extend a stair? So maybe we'll have to look at that and see how we'll implement that. Kind of insinuating that there is a stair. So maybe you don't get 4 floors up and not have one means of egress stair. Oh,
I understand the intent. I can see it being misconstrued by a building official who's a little overzealous.
yeah.
Not that you guys ever do that.
We will look at that and report. We'll give you a building official opinion.
I also had a question on 3314, kind of wanted Ryan's opinion on where he feels that would be necessary, or where that would come into the play for when you'd be concerned.
sure. So we also do have the requirements during construction chapter in the fire code. And I looked at this quickly before we started this morning, and that section's actually a lot more expanded in our code. So we'll report to it in that. The only place that I'd really see this coming into play is if we had probably a really large wood structure that is up next to a high hazard, where we'd be concerned about the possibility of an act occurring or an accident where, it'd put many people at risk. So we've never required this, prior during construction, but like I said, the only thing I could think of is something maybe downtown where you're building a large wooden 5-story wood structure right up next to the hospital or something,
Yeah. Well, that's kind of why I bring that up, because I know we're currently framing on a 7-story structure, where that could come into play. And, we're the framer on it, we're not the general, but I could see where if we're gonna require security on these sites, we're gonna have to get that out there so that cost is figured in, because it's not gonna be, especially if you're doing winter construction, having a standpipe doesn't do anything for you. It's froze, so, I mean, there's gonna be some, we're gonna have to pay attention to that and make sure that it's out there for everybody to include that security personnel if they need to man it overnight.
Yeah, and nationwide, there's been a push on this because of just so many large wood frame buildings that have caught fire during construction, and then they're typically a total loss because they're nearly impossible to stop. And so they have been looking at security requirements, fire watch, and those types of
Yeah,
things.
I fully understand why, I get that,
Yep.
but we would just, if we're gonna change that as part of our deal here, we're gonna have to make sure that we clearly get that out to the contractors in town so they include that cost.
Yep.
And even just clarifying what the 40 feet is if it's a sloped roof, can it be 40 feet to the peak, or is it to the eave? That can make a big difference too on a 612 roof. What is over that 40-foot threshold?
Many times that type of section references a floor, if it doesn't in there.
So what we could do is when we hear this, it's 3304 in the fire code also, and then there's 3 additional subsections that come with it in the fire code. We could look at, if we want to clarify some of that and then pull it into both at the end.
If you wanna consider that, and we'll address it when you present.
Sure.
Okay, any other further questions? Okay. That is all I have for you on that, then.
I think that ends our presentations on that. Our next thing on the agenda is election of officers.
So, thank you, Clay, for acting as chairman. We do need an annual election of officers at this time, so you can call for nominations for chairman or vice. Mark was vice, and he is eligible for a second term as vice. So why don't you go one at a time, chairman and then vice chairman for election.
I would call for nominations for vice chairman.
You want to do that again?
Mike Wild.
Whoever isn't here is getting it there. Was that for sure?
Is there a list of duties in here somewhere?
Just
It's similar to any board. You would act if the president couldn't make the meeting to call it to order and go through the agenda.
Okay, sure.
We have that. Do we have I guess a nomination? Do we need a second on that nomination?
Second.
Second. All in favor, signify by saying aye.
Aye.
Opposed? Mike is elected vice chair. We're looking for a nomination for chairman.
They have to be present. Can we nominate Mark then to be, he was vice chair, so now we can nominate him to be chair, moving up.
That'll teach him.
I believe we asked Mark prior to the last meeting, and well, you can maybe help me with his words, that he would like more time.
He's uncomfortable running a meeting at this point, but could learn.
But that doesn't mean you can't act.
That must take me out because I'm younger yet even, so I guess I'm out of the picture.
Anybody else got any thoughts on that, or want to second that one, or where do we set?
So Clay, you were just acting as chair? Have you been chair before?
Not in this organization. I was president of HBA, so I've ran a lot of meetings
Lot of
before.
experience then.
Yeah, sounds like a good
Some.
candidate to me.
I guess I'm fine with that if no one else wants to step up. I mean, I've only been here a year also, but I do have experience doing it, so.
Yeah, I've been here a while, but my term, I think, is going to be expiring in a couple, 2 or 3 years or whatever. I don't know when that is. So I'm a short timer, so.
We've been very flexible with those. We appreciate all the members and their activity in this board, so.
Well, I'll nominate Clay since he has good experience.
I'll second.
Any further comments? All in favor, signify by saying aye.
Aye.
Opposed? Okay, that business is done. We have a correction to bylaws to address.
And Ryan did point out that there's a couple paragraphs in the bylaws. You should have received those. And one does have some of notes about the chair and the vice chair in there. Why don't we have Gretchen just point out the changes that are made?
Sure. On the first page, item 3 in the meetings section, the third point down, regular meetings. We don't meet at 9 a.m., we meet at 9:30. So I wanted to make that correction. And it's highlighted, I believe, in yellow on your sheet. Going to section 7, appeals to the board. I believe this is a typo that we charge $15. It should be $150, but without making that correction to the documents, we need a motion to approve that. And the reason being is, I believe at one point, there was no charge for an appeal, and it was creating many meetings that were
Frivolous.
frivolous, yes. So now we charge for a meeting and then it's kind of limited the number of meetings
Want
that we
to
have.
charge
that
enough
are-
to make them be serious about it anyway?
Yes, it's got to be more serious.
At least cost them more than $150 to have to do it. You're getting that?
We just felt that this should match with our website.
Okay.
If somebody brought it to our attention, we'd have to allow it to happen, and maybe we'd be back at the point where everybody wanted to pile on for $15 a crack, and
Okay.
felt it should be corrected.
Anything further, Gretchen? Is that it? Okay. Motion to approve the changes to the bylaws?
I'll make a motion to approve.
Second.
Second.
All in favor, signify by saying aye.
Aye.
Opposed? Motion carries. Now we're moving on to staff reports.
I don't have anything at this time.
Okay. Hearing nothing there, we'll ask for a motion to adjourn.
Motion to adjourn?
Second. All in
Second.
favor?
Aye.
Motion to adjourn is granted. We are done.